Welcome, everybody, to the final episode in our series on the Great Awakening. A foggy day on Olympus is the place where, despite the fog of passions and ideology swirling all about us, we try to reach dispassionate, non-agenda driven judgments about history, religion, and culture, and why they matter. My name is Coel Campo.
And I'm her sidekick, Mike Pierce, just here to make you realize how much better you like listening to Coel.
Hardly.
I think so.
Something like that, maybe.
People will tell us in the comments, I'm sure of it.
Yeah, let us know. Today, we get to talk about the guy with the bulgy eyes, and no, not Mike this time, but his name is Charles Grandison Finney, and he is America's most important evangelist in the first half of the 19th century. And his new measures, which we now consider old measures, but in many respects, they're still with us.
Indeed. And this whole period, revivalism in the early republic throws up some burning issues which simply refuse to go away.
Yeah, for example, where do pragmatic measures that help to convey the Christian message stop, and it turns into mere manipulation of the audience or the congregation? When does that start?
How far is it legitimate to use attention-grabbing publicity or other measures in a modern world ever more crowded with distractions? And at what point does that degenerate into being mere entertainment or even show business?
Yeah, and furthermore, should Christian leadership, ministry, preaching, etc., be the prerogative of people with proper theological education, or are they, like Mike, the problem, a sort of latter-day Pharisee? That's right. We could say that should these things instead be in the hands of the unlearned and the unskilled, people like Galilean fishermen, but it seems like there are some pretty serious disadvantages either way.
And as we're about to see, these were the hottest issues in America from the 1780s until the mid-19th century.
So, as we saw in the last episode, when we considered the Kentucky and Tennessee revivals in the years around 1800, there was a lot of pretty wild stuff happening in the young United States.
Yeah, including the revival in Vermont.
Yeah, which we think of as a sedate, not very religious place.
And it's a good example of the general phenomenon. So the Vermont revival seems to have got going in 1816, the year without a summer. And so a time of crop failure, serious hardship, and it gradually grew from there.
I'm curious, before you go on, year without a summer?
They didn't know, but now we do. There was a huge volcanic eruption at Mount Tambora in 1815. That's in what is now Indonesia. And dust and gas in the atmosphere cooled global temperatures by 1 degree centigrade, and the effects were worst in New England, Atlantic Canada, and Western Europe. In this circumstance, people started to care more about the state of their souls. And so the revivalists got more of a hold, and this kind of grew on itself over the following 15 to 20 years. By 1831, one inhabitant of Peacham, Vermont, was writing to his brother that religion was suddenly the all-engrossing subject. Most of the town has had protracted meetings continuing 4 or 5 days. So general is the work that there's hardly a person among us who doesn't feel anxious to share in its benefits. Our old minister sees a day which he dared not to hope for. And by the mid-1830s, 80% of the population of this previously rather non-observant state were regular churchgoers. and the state saw a growing support for abolitionism and a big drop in sales of alcohol.
And for anybody who maybe hasn't cracked the cover of a history book since school days, we mentioned abolitionism, and that was the campaign to end slavery in America.
Yeah, indeed it was. And we have here a painting made in the late 1830s of the Vermont revival of that decade. And I'm starting to think, though I don't know, that the preacher in question is one Lorenzo Dow, of whom more in a few moments. There's the painting again on the front cover of a book I really want to strongly recommend. Now, this is a classic book that came out in 1989. Some commentators called it the best book on the church history of America in this period ever produced. It is absolutely stunning, and it raises huge social and political issues as well as simply religious ones. He argues that the passion for equality in the young United States in the 50 years or so after the completion of the War of Independence, the American Revolution, brought about a crisis of religious authority.
Religious authority, we're not talking about replacing the Bible. We're talking about who gets to interpret it for us and how.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Hatch says, to give a quote from him, America exalted religious leaders short on social graces, family connections, and literary education. These religious activists pitched their messages to the unschooled and unsophisticated. Their movements offered the humble a marvelous sense of individual potential and of collective aspiration. Religious populism has been a residual agent of change in America over the last 2 centuries. Hard to argue with that one from where we sit right now.
Yeah.
Increasingly assertive common people wanted their leaders unpretentious, their doctrines self-evident and down to earth, their music lively and singable, and their churches in local hands. The rise of evangelical Christianity in the early republic is, in some senses, a story of the success of common people in shaping the culture after their own priorities, rather than the priorities outlined by gentlemen such as the framers of the Constitution. Ouch.
Oof.
The agitations of these religious insurgents brought into being new churches and denominations in which authority depended not on education, status, ordination, or state support, but on the ability to move people and retain their confidence. And of course, that's still with us. Attempting to erase the difference between leaders and followers, Americans opened the door to religious demagogues.
Wow.
Yeah, that's an idea we'll kick around again, I think, in a few minutes, because, of course, we're all familiar, and not just in religious matters, but maybe particularly there in political ones too, to the person who says, I'm just like you, my friends, I'm not part of that elite over there. And then the next thing you know, they've turned themselves into some kind of tyrant who, obviously in the church context, tells you what to do because the Holy Spirit inspired me. And
Yeah.
it puts one in mind of the biblical phrase, the last state is worse than the first. They come out from under the tyranny of religious scholars and end up under a demagogic, unlettered tyrant of another sort.
That's right.
It introduced new forms of theology. It produced a proliferation of religious movements.
Yeah, and this is at least partly the origins of America's super proliferation of denominations, because it seems that Americans have zero inhibitions about starting a new group or movement.
Yes, it's not the whole of the explanation. A lot of it is to do with patterns of immigration and ongoing waves of immigration into America, something that Niebuhr talked about in his 1940s book, I think, Social Sources of Denominationalism. But nevertheless, this is another large part. People felt completely disinhibited from branching out anew and starting their own church that has finally got it right. That. And again, that's still with us. Yeah.
Yeah. You and I have said that sometimes ourselves.
Yeah. We need to start our own church. Yeah, that's true. That's perfectly true. There you go. I must be an American after all. Okay.
Right.
It reshaped preaching and singing and publishing, religious publishing, and it sought to justify 19th century American individualism from Scripture.
Christians have been historically really bad at finding the values and priorities of their own societies as being reflected in Scripture.
I really can't imagine what you're talking about. Yeah. They've been really, really bad at that. Yeah. Taking the things they would have thought anyway and putting "Thus saith the Lord" in front of them. Oh my stars. Yes. Here's another quotation from Hatch. He really is worth reading, and I found it hard to restrain myself from including perhaps too much of his material, but he really does have a lot worth saying. The fundamental religious quarrel of the late 18th century in America now was not between Calvinist and Arminian, orthodox and Unitarian, evangelical and free thinker, but between radically different conceptions of the Christian ministry. As respectable clergymen in these turbulent years reiterated their confidence in learning and civility, potent strains of anti-clericalism welled up within the bounds of the church, challenging the right of any special order to mediate the gospel. In the first place, they became an integral part of a profound upsurge to erase the distinction between gentleman and commoner, privileged classes and the people. This was the essence of the struggle between federalist and anti-federalist. For non-Americans, we should explain that these were the main political parties, such as they were in the early American Republic. And like the anti-federalists, these religious dissenters refused to accept the authority of names and the influence of the great. Obscure Christians without social grace began to piece together a popular theology. Christ as a carpenter's son, the apostle as poor and uneducated, and the crowd shouting Hosanna while the rich and powerful sought his death.
If we think about it, let's reckon up the balance of advantages here. The chances of any old ignorant person getting into the thought world of people 2,000 or even 3,000 years ago and understanding what they meant is vanishingly small.
And yet, even religious scholars have an awfully bad habit of finding their favoured politics, things very specific to their own time and place, in the Bible, and ditto concerning morality. We've
Right.
both been up close against such people, haven't we?
Yeah, I've probably seen one or two.
Yeah.
So do you think that this means that scholarship is really of no advantage? I realize that's a silly question to ask you, but
And predictably, I want to say, no, it's a huge advantage. The point is that no amount of learning will release you from the biases that make you want to justify yourself or your outlook on the world, unless
what?
Unless you are seriously willing to be self-critical. Now, there's one expression, and I'm probably going to quote it very inexactly, from a church historian writing about 60 years ago on a rather different subject to what we're talking about. And he said that the requirement to demythologize not the biblical text, he was writing at the time of high liberalism, but of the presuppositions of one's own society, is the first requirement of a biblical theologian. That is, unless you're prepared to debunk loads of the things that you grew up with and the things that you instinctively want to believe, no amount of learning will really enable you to grapple with that text because you'll just read them back into the text.
Yeah.
And finally, first century Galilean peasants don't think the same way as you at all. Their entire mental furniture is different.
Yeah, I would imagine so. So, are we making a case here that only a very good and broad education qualifies a person to interpret the Bible? Doesn't that then deliver Christians into the hands of an elite? Because that does seem to be in some conflict with the emphasis of Jesus, as well as the example of the earliest church.
Right. We can't restrict leadership and teaching to them.
But on the other hand, if we give too loud a voice to the butcher, the baker, and the candlestick maker, we're going to fill our ears with nonsense,
And as Hatch says, we'll open the door to religious demagogues.
which we chuckled about being observably true today. Some preacher jumps up presenting himself as just a regular guy, and therefore somehow more to be trusted than the fancy schmancy experts, and he shouts at us all.
Before we know it, he's an ignorant religious dictator.
So we're framing a rock and a hard place here. What do you think the answer is?
I'm not sure there is a once and for all answer, but I do like to point out that the leading figures in the earliest church were a Galilean fisherman and a highly educated Jewish intellectual, Peter and Paul. And yes, they argued with one another, and that we need both, each to act as a corrective on the other. That Christianity isn't an intellectual system. It's about having a transformed life, an inner life as well as an outer life. Right? But nevertheless, if it's not to go astray theologically or to buckle to hostile current intellectual trends outside the church, then it's going to need some intellectual heft. And so
Right.
you need both. But that's tricky to do, and it's tricky to keep on doing without collapsing on one side or the other. But I think that's where we need to be aiming at.
Yeah, I think I'd have to agree with you.
Good gracious, madam, are you sure?
I'll
Well,
think about it.
let's come to the guy that I thought was in the picture a few moments ago. This fellow, Lorenzo Dow. He's a classic case in point of the kind of preacher that was emerging and was far more numerous than the trained clergymen in established denominations. And he was the wildest of the wild. He was an eccentric. He was a traveling Methodist evangelist. He's a magnetic preacher who excelled at pulpit drama and histrionics and anti-intellectual and anti-elite rhetoric and drumming up ecstatic outbursts amongst his hearers in meetings. And his autobiography was, for a while, outsold in America only by the Bible, which is incredible. And by
Yeah.
1850, so what's that, 16 years after his death, Lorenzo was one of the most popular names for boys in the country.
It's too bad because it's a nice name.
Yeah.
Well, either way, it's pretty clear which way he'd have answered the questions we were just pondering.
Yeah, I think it is really, yes. Although, to be entirely fair, he doesn't seem to have strayed completely outside the bounds of orthodoxy, whereas some of these people really did. But he was certainly an eccentric. Apparently, he was really unhygienic. He never lived anywhere. He lived his whole life traveling around. He gave away money. He never kept any, which is admirable. Nobody could accuse him of being someone who was lining his own pockets with the offerings of the gullible faithful. That wasn't true. And his wife, can you imagine? Anyway, was pretty nearly as eccentric as he was. Yeah.
Wow. Okay, so to move on to somebody maybe a little more rational, this guy is the figure that we're going to be spending the most time on today. Now, is there a reason for that?
On the one hand, he's the most influential single figure and probably the most important evangelist of the 1820s and following decades in America. One can almost make an apostolic succession of mega evangelists in America from about 1800 up until recently. So he's the first in line, and then following him is D.L. Moody, another giant. And then there is,
Yeah.
unfortunately, the quite atrocious Billy Sunday. And then we get back to another giant with Billy Graham. Yeah, he's the first in line here. And on the other hand, he rides the cusp of at least some of the questions we've just been considering. He uses revivalist methods, but he keeps the drama within bounds. He goes way outside the doctrinal and methodological norms of his denomination, but not completely outside orthodoxy, and he doesn't simply abandon his denomination, the Presbyterians.
On the pragmatism issue, though, he's way over at the other end of the spectrum.
Yeah, he certainly is. Well, we got a nice photo of him here.
Yeah, and he's got those bulging eyes. Are we talking about thyroid problems? This is just, yeah.
Quite possibly. Yeah.
Yeah. Do you think they enhance his magnetism in the pulpit, though?
I'm absolutely sure of it. Lots of people talked about his piercing blue eyes. And it's long seemed to me that quite a number of really influential preachers have either something physically about them, usually their face, or their voice, which just makes people pay attention to them or listen to them. I think that much though Southern accents are derided within the US, I think Billy Graham's quite mild North Carolina accent did him a power of good because it was extremely listenable. It's quite amazing how well British preachers do in America. And in England, how many of the most prominent preachers are Scots or Welsh or Northern Irish? People just like to listen to them. George Whitefield had a turn in his eye, and it always made people feel that he was looking straight at them. So these kind of things actually do help, I think. Yeah.
Well, it's too bad it didn't seem to help your lectures in college very much.
No, you fell asleep anyway. I know, yeah.
Well, it was just so soothing.
I don't know why I even like you, Mrs. Campo.
Me neither.
Oh, well, that makes two of us. You agree about saying?
Yeah.
As we've done with so many of our leading figures, let's just quickly whistle through his biography or the key points of it here. He's born in 1792 in Connecticut, the youngest of 9 children in a Baptist farming family, which moved to northern New York State. And although he never went to college, he was apprenticed as a legal assistant, and he attended a Presbyterian church where he had a powerful conversion experience as a young man. And in 1821, so he's 29 now, he started studying under his pastor to become a licensed Presbyterian minister, though he already had serious doubts about Presbyterian doctrine.
So at this point, he's practicing law without ever having gone to law school. And now he's training to be a licensed preacher, which shows at least some respect for structures, without going to seminary. So he's at least moderately in tune with the anti-professional ethos of the time.
Yes, but although he doesn't just decry them and set himself up on his own account. So he's a little in the middle here.
Yeah, and furthermore, he has to have been the worst Presbyterian ever, because he held free will and entire sanctification, and he rejected original sin. It sounds like he wasn't even remotely reformed.
No, it's just laughable. In his favor, it has to be said that nearly all denominations become internally theologically pluralist in the long term. Loyalty to the club ends up meaning more than loyalty to its original platform. But also, there's a kind of a general pattern, beginning with Jonathan Edwards. We all say Jonathan Edwards was reformed. But if you were a high Calvinist, his behavior and his practices seemed like an outrage, right? Saying this person's converted and that person's not, allowing for instant conversions and all the rest of it. So this was going on amongst the Congregationalists and Presbyterians. Their Calvinism was degrading, not amongst all of them. There were lots of diehards, as we're going to see in a moment, but frequently, yeah. In 1830 to 31, he led a notable revival in Rochester, New York, which he referred to, and then loads of others did afterwards, as the burned over district, because it had loads of local revivals there, and then the whole thing just falling apart, people falling away, wondering what hit them, and they became the hardest ground for evangelists to break into again. But he did it successfully. In 1832, he became minister of a church in New York City where he notably barred all slave owners and slave traders from communion. And his Broadway tabernacle, which he had built, grew rapidly to become one of the largest churches in the US. And in 1835, he became professor of systematic theology at the newly created Oberlin Collegiate Institute, later Oberlin College, where he went on to serve as president some years later. There are obviously plenty of biographies of Finney, and I would say that Keith Hardman's, which is scholarly but accessible, it's tinged with his own Calvinistic outlook, it's probably still the best available. But it's not new now. So if you look for it online, you're probably going to have to buy a second-hand copy, but it's definitely worth doing. One of the most famous things about Finney and his career, of course, is what he and his associates called their new measures, which were in many ways very successful and got them into a lot of hot water. The most famous of those is what he called the anxious bench, or the anxious seat.
Yeah, this is the beginning of come on down to the front, isn't it?
Yeah, it certainly is. It began here, folks. Yeah. What did Billy Graham say? I want you to get up out of your seats. People who are anxious for the state of their souls, they think they want to commit their lives to Christ. I think all that may have faded away in the past few decades. Have you seen preachers still using this?
It's been a little while now, but I've seen an altar call or two even still. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. He was holding evangelistic meetings in towns without consulting local churches.
And this is very parachurch, isn't it? The evangelistic organization that does its own thing on the assumption that most local churches are either apostate or else don't know what they're doing.
Which may be often true, of course. But yeah, it's not really a very proper way to behave, but he did it, yes. Holding long drawn out meetings to crank up the emotional and psychological pressure on people. Direct challenges to be converted now. Now that's, again, all new. You need to make a decision right now, that stuff. Holding meetings in a town several nights in a row, again, to ramp up the pressure on people who are still hovering on the brink. Praying aloud for individuals by name to be converted in the meeting. Well, no pressure there then. And repeated singing of the same hymn to heighten emotional effect.
Now, this one is funny because this still goes on all the time.
I hate most of what goes on now under the guise of what I mockingly call worship. But apart from the endless repetition to crank up emotional pressure, one can't really blame Finney for all the stuff we're now saddled with. But he does at least start that. Yeah, that's him.
Yeah. But maybe back to the more general point. Isn't this all simply psychological manipulation? Surely that isn't legitimate.
No, it's not really. It's not as bad as what some people later elaborate on. but it could certainly be read as manipulative, treating conversion as something that can simply be virtually manufactured by the right methods. Finney actually says in 1833, or he writes, a revival is not a miracle or dependent on a miracle in any sense. It's a purely philosophical result of the right use of the constituted means. Now, this is the modern mentality, pragmatism, taken to the utmost.
Even you are more Calvinistic than that.
Yeah, I didn't think I could find someone who's less Calvinistic than me, but maybe Finney was. Yeah. And of course, what Calvinists would have said and did say was that this was attempting to manufacture by human means something that only God could do. And I'm almost for once tempted to agree with them. But of course, trouble with that argument is, do you take that opposing argument all the way? Because even the most Calvinistic person is going to preach in a language that they expect their hearers to be able to understand and to frame themselves in a way that the hearers will hopefully find persuasive and use arguments that the hearers will hopefully find persuasive. If you're really going to leave everything entirely up to God, you'll probably just remain silent. Something is going to be done. So if what Finney and his ilk are doing is excessive, but the opposite is simply nuts, you just do nothing at all, where's the middle? Where's the middle?
Right.
And the answer to that is not always clear. But psychological manipulation needs to be shunned as the sin of witchcraft, I think. Yes.
Yeah, I wonder if some of it isn't just due to the intentions of the person speaking. Of course, that's not something that you can measure, so.
But there's something incredibly modern about this conscious calculation of doing things a particular way to maximize results.
Yeah.
Now, Finney justified his new measures. He said, without new measures, it's impossible that the church succeed in gaining the attention of the world to religion. There are so many exciting subjects constantly brought before the public mind that the church cannot maintain her ground without sufficient novelty, mark that word, in measures to get the public ear. The measures of politicians, of infidels and heretics, and the 10,000 exciting and counteracting influences that bear upon the church and upon the world will gain men's attention and turn them away from the sanctuary and from the altars of the Lord, unless we wisely adopt such new measures as are calculated to get the attention of men to the gospel of Christ. It's evident that we must have more amusing preaching to meet the character and wants of the age. Ministers are generally beginning to find this out, and some of them complain of it. The character of the age is changed, but these men retain the same stiff, dry, prosing style of preaching that answered half a century ago.
So he's writing this in the 1830s, and by this point, we're definitely in modern times. There are newspapers, novels, popular songs, popular interest in politics. You've got more theaters and concerts than ever before. So basically, Finney's saying that Christians need to shout to be heard. So does that justify almost any stunt or even making evangelism or church meetings generally like a form of entertainment?
Yeah, I don't think it does justify any stunt, but clearly Finney did. And most supposedly evangelical churches today seem to emphasize church as spectacle every bit as much as Roman Catholic ritual and art. And yes, I'm saying it that way on purpose to annoy them. They're really putting all their effort into creating a spectacle, just in a different, and I would argue, more barbaric way. Am I arguing that we should all go and become Roman Catholics? There'll be some Roman Catholics listening to us who'll be rejoicing and saying, see, yes, that's not quite what I'm arguing. But in a sense, it's almost impossible not to go some way down this route. Right? You come into the 20th century, and the Pentecostals are most notable because they're very pragmatic in being the first to launch Christian radio, and then later on Christian TV. And look at us now. What are we doing here? We're utilizing the internet. And people below a certain age mocking us, or mostly mocking me, for this video not being nearly fancy or sophisticated or artificial intelligence-ified enough. Right?
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't think we're going to have any viewers left by the time you're done making all these points.
Maybe not. But yes, there was pushback, and we ought to pay attention in particular to this man, Aziel Nettleton. He was a widely respected congregational evangelist, but unlike Finney, his campaigns were closely coordinated with local churches. In fact, if he got an invitation from a church and he thought that they didn't really mean it, he would turn them down. And he's believed to have been instrumental in 30,000 conversions. Although, if he was a really good Calvinist, he shouldn't have been counting or doing anything more than wildly surmise about anybody at all. But there we are. As a Calvinist, he was appalled by Finney's doctrines, and especially by his introduction of the anxious seat.
Now, at this point, I'm thinking that surely he was right to criticize Finney's extremes.
Yeah, but as we said a moment ago, how far do we want to take Nettleton's arguments? Now, even a Calvinist will, in practice, including Nettleton, use means that he thinks are calculated to persuade people to commit themselves to Christ.
Yeah.
And who's to say, other than tradition that he wants to sanctify as somehow what the Bible says, but that may not be it at all, what the difference is between what he's doing and what Finney's doing. And yet, clearly, to follow either of these directions of thought to an extreme is to embrace madness. Madness, perhaps, if you follow the Calvinist argument to its logical conclusion, and manipulation, if you follow Finney's pragmatism. Yeah, it's a real tough one. There were, as we've said, these protests against his new measures. This is a defense made by one of Finney's associates against these protests. Formerly, he said, it had been supposed necessary that a sinner should remain under conviction a long time. And they evidently had the impression that the longer they were under conviction, the greater was the evidence that they were truly converted. We taught the opposite of this.
Now, what he's saying here relates back to the Calvinist doctrine of limited atonement.
Yes, that is the Calvinist idea that the New Testament notwithstanding, Christ apparently did not die for the sins of the world, but only for the predestined elect.
Right. So then what happens is the person being evangelized needs to ask him or herself, am I one of those for whom Christ died? And that really puts them in one heck of a bind.
It does. And that's why in the Calvinistic tradition, conversions take a long period of time as people are, quote, wrestling with their conscience, not in either of the senses that we use nowadays, right? Nowadays, wrestling with my conscience either means I'm not sure what's the right thing to do here. I'm really torn. I really need to figure it all out. Or it can mean I know exactly what's the right thing to do, but heck, I don't want to do it. Right. But this doesn't mean either of those things. This means people wrestling with the idea, am I one of those for whom Christ died? And that takes a long time in that kind of a tradition.
So The Arminians actually said the opposite, that conversions should be instant, or else they weren't real conversions.
Right.
But you think that both sides were talking nonsense about all of this.
Yes. Please go back and listen, viewers, to the third episode in this series about Jonathan Edwards, where we talk about exactly this. And I argue that whether conversions take a long time or whether they're quick depends on how much your target audience already knows about the message. So if you're in 18th or 19th century Britain or America, Arminianism will seem to be true because conversions are likely to be quick because most people already know the stuff. Whereas if you're in a pagan culture like we are now, Calvinism will appear to be true because people are going to take a long time to work through all the big objections that they have to Christian ideas. But in fact, Calvinism and Arminianism are completely irrelevant in the case. It's about sociology of knowledge. But anyway, that's ground we cover elsewhere. So such sudden conversions were alarming to many good people. And of course, they predicted that the converts would fall away and prove not to be soundly converted. But the event proved that among those sudden conversions were some of the most influential Christians that ever have been known in that region of the country, which sounds like a politician's answer to me. That sounds like there's a tacit admission there that some of them did fall away, but some of them were good ones.
Right.
Okay, here we've got a picture of the anxious seat. People coming down the front, anxious about the state of their souls. But the new measures were far from the only outstanding feature in Finney's ministry. He repudiated the doctrine of original sin.
Now, some people will leap to the conclusion that Finney is being heretical on this point. I do remember that our eyebrows shot up in class when you said that you didn't believe in original sin.
Yes, but the anxiety was misplaced for several closely related reasons. Firstly, most evangelicals only think they believe in original sin, but actually they don't. When you press them hard, what they believe in is that all people are sinful, which is undoubtedly true, right?
Right.
But original sin is the doctrine that we're born in a state of damnation because sexually procreated. And secondly, that doctrine, original sin, wasn't taught until Augustine around 400 AD.
Yes, for which please go back and look at the fourth episode in our series, The End of the Early Church.
And thirdly, a whole load of perfectly orthodox, and indeed orthodox with a capital O, people have in fact rejected this doctrine. Finney is one of them.
Right.
I'm not sure I quite like the way that he argues his case here. It sounds a little arid, maybe a little legalistic. He says moral depravity is sin. Yeah. It cannot consist in anything that is an original and essential part of mind or of body, nor in any involuntary action or state of either mind or body. It cannot consist of anything back of choice, and that sustains to choice the relation of a cause. That is actually valid. He's saying we are sinful because we chose to act in sinful ways. If we could not do otherwise, then we would not be guilty, because it would simply be like, your nose or your arm or something. It just is.
Right.
Whatever is back of choice is without the pale of legislation, the law. Moral depravity consists in selfishness or in the choice of self-interest, self-gratification, or self-indulgence as an end. Consequently, it cannot consist in a sinful constitution. It cannot be an attribute of human nature, for this would be physical and not moral depravity. It's a little more complicated than that, Mr. Finney, but okay. Moral depravity is not then to be accounted for by accounting it to a nature or constitution sinful in itself, To talk of a sinful nature or sinful constitution in the sense of physical sinfulness is to ascribe sinfulness to the Creator, who's the author of nature. This is one of the big problems with the Augustinian doctrine, that by the time you trace it back to the cause, then it goes back to God, which is a pretty big problem. But what he is skipping over here, too lightly it seems to me, is that we do end up with a sinful nature because we sin ourselves into it. That is, as with all of our actions, actually, not just sinful ones, that our choices become habits, and our habits then form character, which is extremely consonant with what Paul says in Romans 1 and 2 and the repeated use of the phrase, and God gave them over. So he's making it a little more wooden and a little too simple here, but okay. He says it's to overlook the essential nature of sin and to make sin a physical virus instead of a voluntary and responsible choice. But unfortunately, writers on moral depravity have assumed that moral depravity was distinct from and the cause of sin, that is, of actual transgression. They call it original sin, indwelling sin, a sinful nature, an appetite for sin, an attribute of human nature, and the like, all of which he denied. Okay, but that is in danger of sounding legalistic there, I think.
Yeah.
We also need to take account of his doctrine of entire sanctification.
Now, this was the doctrine first popularized by John Wesley a century earlier, but it's spreading out beyond just Methodism by this point, isn't it?
Yes, it certainly is. It's becoming absolutely huge and will continue to do so for the rest of the 19th century. At a wild estimate, I would say that by the time you get to the 1890s or so, it's half or even more than half of all evangelicalism. And certainly Finney himself claimed to have had a powerful experience of baptism in the Holy Ghost, which was understood then not in the Pentecostal sense that it's now often understood to be, but in the sense of receiving a post-conversion experience of entire sanctification. So, now, does not the apostle speak in this passage, 2 Corinthians 7, as if he really expected those to whom he wrote to perfect holiness in the fear of God? Observe how strong and full the language is. Let us cleanse ourselves from all filthiness of the flesh and spirit. If to cleanse ourselves from all filthiness of the flesh and all filthiness of the spirit, and to perfect holiness be not entire sanctification, what is? That he expected this to take place in this life is evident from the fact that he requires them to be cleansed from all filthiness of the flesh as well as of the spirit. This passage plainly contemplates a state as distinguished from an act of consecration or sanctification. So it's an ongoing experience, a state. That is, it evidently expresses the idea of entire in the sense of continued sanctification. That this state may be attained in this life, I argue, from the fact that provision is made against all the occasions of sin. Men sin only when they are tempted either by the world, the flesh, or the devil. And it's expressly asserted that in every temptation, provision is made for our escape. Certainly, it's possible for us to escape without sin under every temptation. Then a state of entire and permanent sanctification is attainable.
Okay, so there's a lot going on here, and it all sounds pretty logical, actually. The sticking point in this, which you've mentioned before, is where are these entirely sanctified people? Was Finney offering himself as an example? Because he seems to me to have been quite a quarrelsome, combative sort of person.
You know me.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, we could hold you up as a model citizen.
Right. Yeah, really is a pretty big problem with it, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, he was a combative sort of person. So what are we going to say
I,
then?
I like the billboard that's around town where I live for advertising for one of the churches here. It says "No perfect people allowed."
Yeah.
Speaking of
Well,
marketing,
of course, we were both in a college that, at least in theory, was committed to this belief.
right,
I'm trying to think of anybody
right.
who was actually perfect there.
And we probably shouldn't name names.
We
That
shouldn't
wouldn't be
be
right.
named, no. Yeah, we should definitely do that. We mentioned earlier Oberlin College, and here it is, founded in 1833, although the photo on the left shows how it looked in 1860, and then on the right, how it looks today. It was the first college in America to admit African American students in 1835 and women students in 1837.
Yeah, now this is the college we mentioned earlier that Finney ended up at, but it's not really a Christian place today, is it?
No, but it does have this past, and it was a trailblazer at the time, as we've just said. So it was founded as Oberlin Collegiate Institute in 1833 by two revivalist Presbyterian ministers, both friends and colleagues of Finney. It was intended to train up missionaries and inaugurate God's government on earth.
This phrase, inaugurate God's government on earth, it sounds like we're back with postmillennialism here.
Yes, we are. The idea that Christ will come back after the saints set up the 1,000-year reign on the earth, which was the general belief amongst most evangelicals in the 18th and for a lot of the 19th century before they swung over to the opposite extreme of dispensationalism. Yeah, and if the long words lost some of our audience there, I'm sorry. We do talk about this in some other episodes, so we're not going to rehash it all again now. But yeah, this was the way they thought.
Basically, you should go back and watch our entire channel at this point.
I think you should actually. I think that would do people a lot of good.
Yeah.
Treat it as a much cheaper alternative to therapy. Oh no, therapy is what you'll need after you've watched it more. Okay, never mind. We won't go there. Right. So the college was fiercely abolitionist. Its staff were a mainstay of the newspaper, The Liberator, campaigning constantly to end slavery. This is, of course, the run-up decades to the American Civil War. And Oberlin was a stop on the Underground Railway.
Which is pretty cool, and we should explain for non-American viewers that the Underground Railway wasn't a railway at all. It was a network of abolitionists who smuggled slaves out of the South and into the free states.
Yes, that was what was happening. And I think it's significant that changes in admissions policies happened very shortly after Finney was appointed to teach there. Although he was pushing on an open door, his colleagues weren't going to push back on that at all. Yeah.
So, just to finish this out here, we're about to see that it wasn't just the old school Presbyterians who opposed the rising tide of modern pragmatic measures in evangelism. Some people resisted all of them completely.
Yes, they did. And as a prime example of this, we should look at the primitive Baptists who rejected all modern innovations. By the way, this group still exists today. I've been fiddling around online, and they still have quite a lot of churches, actually, particularly in the South. The rise of revivalist methods was accompanied, as we've seen, by a proliferation of what we now call parachurch activities. And some people rejected all of this. So the modern parachurch activities included missionary boards.
Now, as we noted in the last episode of this series, the rise of mission societies was very recent and could be traced back to the British Baptists.
And most other denominations on both sides of the Atlantic swiftly followed. Yeah. But also there are denominational seminaries opening up, and there are temperance societies.
And temperance meant opposition to drinking alcohol.
Yes, and this issue would be extremely important down to the 1930s, especially in America.
And this issue remains important to some evangelicals even today.
Which is why you and I never touched the terrible stuff while we were in Houghton College, did we, Kill?
No, absolutely not. Of course.
Okay, well, they're dodging lightning bolts. Let's carry on. So there are tract societies, Bible societies, Sunday schools.
Now, as we noted again in the last episode in this series, Sunday schools only got going from the 1780s onwards. And like mission societies, they spread extremely rapidly.
Yep, by the time that we're talking about, they were everywhere. And camp meetings, of course, which we've had occasion to notice a number of times. Now, a number of Baptists rejected all of these modern innovations and insisted upon congregational ministry alone. And a meeting at Black Rock Church in Butler, Maryland in 1832 led to a secession of the primitives from the missionary Baptists. The missionary Baptists were the ones who liked the new innovation of mission societies and had their own, and the primitives are those reacting against it. We've got a nice picture here of Cool Springs Primitive Baptist Church at Travelers Rest in South Carolina. It was built in the 1830s when the group got going, and it was in use until 1956, although I should hasten to add that the church didn't die out in 1956. They're still there, but they now have a relatively new brick-built structure. But I just thought that the old one looked cool.
True to its name.
Yes, exactly. This is the Black Rock Address, and we include it here because it's how some people reacted to all of the innovations that we've been discussing. If we were to admit that tracts may have occasionally been made instrumental by the Holy Ghost for imparting instruction or comfort to inquiring minds, it would by no means imply that tracts are an instituted means of salvation. So they're pushing back on the pragmatism. Sunday schools come next under consideration. These assume the same high stand as do tract societies. They claim the honour of converting their tens of thousands. Such arrogant pretensions we feel bound to oppose. First, because these, as well as the pretensions of the tract societies, are grounded upon the notion that conversion or regeneration is produced by impressions made upon the natural mind by means of religious sentiments instilled into it. I think at the end of the day, this speaker would have had the same thoughts. Otherwise, why is he addressing us and trying to persuade us?
Right.
And if the Holy Ghost is allowed to be at all concerned in the thing, it's in a way which implies he's being somehow blended with the instruction or necessarily attendant upon it, all of which we know to be wrong. Oh, we know that. I wanted to believe that this was simply a fairly recent innovation among people who like to put forward a contentious, highly questionable idea surrounded by that phrase when all they really mean is that I and a few of my friends think this. But apparently it's got a longer history. We pass to the consideration of the Bible Society. The idea of giving the Bible without note or comment is calculated to meet the approbation of all who know the importance of the sacred scriptures. But we see reared in the case of the American Bible Society a combination of all parties in politics and all sects in religion, and the distinctive differences of the one and the sectarian differences of the other, in part thrown aside to form the union. Yeah, that's the point. You don't think that's a good thing? We will now call your attention to the subject of missions. We have no right to depart from the order which the Master himself has seen fit to lay down relative to the ministration of the word. Colleges and theological schools next claim our attention. In speaking of colleges, we wish to be distinctly understood that it's not to colleges or collegial education as such that we have any objection. We're not really anti-intellectual. We would cheerfully afford our own children such an education, did circumstances warrant the measure, which implies that he thinks they don't. But we object in the first place to sectarian colleges as such.
Now, wait a minute here, because they're saying Bible and tract societies are all wrong because they mix parties and denominations. But then theological schools are all wrong because they don't. So, what kind of argumentation is this?
Yeah, we're not to look for consistency there, except in opposition to all of the modern innovations and pragmatic measures taken by evangelists and churches and the creation of parachurch organizations. That's the only consistent element there, yeah. And finally, but following the same note, really, the idea of a Baptist college and of a Presbyterian college, etc., necessarily implies that our distinct views of church government, of gospel doctrine, and gospel ordinances are connected with human sciences, a principle which we cannot admit. In the second place, we object to the notion of attaching professorships of divinity to colleges, because this evidently implies that the revelation which God has made of himself is a human science on a footing with mathematics, philosophy, law, etc. Now, I'm not sure many people would make this kind of argument nowadays, but there are still, alas, many churches which, although they don't say it in so many words, nevertheless express the thought that going to college to study engineering or French literature is just fine, but that going to college to study theology is something desperately wicked or likely to destroy your faith. Which in some places I suppose it might, but then so might going to study engineering. Okay. Thirdly, we decidedly object to persons, after professing to have been called of the Lord to preach his gospel, going to a college or academy to fit themselves for that service. Again, this is because they think that all such preparation should happen within the context of the local congregation. And if any particular kind of learning that relates to that isn't available in the congregation, too bad. We now pass to the last item, which we think it necessary particularly to notice, viz. 4 days or protracted meetings. Regeneration, we believe, is exclusively the work of the Holy Ghost, performed by his divine power at his own sovereign pleasure. But these meetings are got up either for the purpose of inducing the Holy Spirit to regenerate multitudes who would otherwise not be converted, or to convert them themselves by the machinery of these meetings.
So these folks are opposed to an educated, sophisticated clergy on the one hand, but they're also opposed to all the other revivalist and pragmatic methods on the other.
Yes, they are a little unusual. Normally, the people who are the anti-intellectuals you expect to be ultra-pragmatists, right? Like Lorenzo Dow, or in favor of emotionalism and all of this stuff. Whereas these people are opposed to all of that stuff, but they're nevertheless anti-intellectual. A lot of this, one suspects, is coming from not so much Calvinism as hyper-Calvinism, following the logic of Calvinism on through to the point where you don't really evangelize because God's already decided who he's going to save. And that was a much more widespread phenomenon than is generally appreciated nowadays, I think. 8 years after this, the Baptists would split again, as many other denominations did, the Methodists and the Presbyterians, over the slavery issue. But in the case of the formation of the Southern Baptists, it wasn't only about slavery. It was also about their opposition to modern missions and their attachment to hyper-Calvinism, which is a pretty embarrassing birth certificate for the venerable Southern Baptists, isn't it?
Yes.
All these things need to be faced. Yeah.
We did tell you it was a foggy day on Olympus in the first place.
Yes.
I think that's about going to do it for today. So hopefully you guys enjoyed that episode. I personally am going to be thinking about choices becoming habits and habits becoming our nature for the next couple of days.
It has not all been in vain.
That's right. But we would love it if you guys would repost the videos, share them with other people, just encourage the rest of the creation with our wonderful knowledge that we've got going on here.
Right. We hope you've enjoyed this series, and we're going to be coming back in a couple of weeks with a brand new series about the Crusades. So we're
Yes.
shifting gear, winding back rather a lot of centuries to look at some rather disastrous events and how, as so often when people are thinking about the past, we misunderstand a lot of what's going on. So we're going to try and bring at least a little clarity to that whole vexed issue. So we look forward to seeing you then, everybody, and thank you for staying with us. Bye bye now.
Bye, everyone.